We are in Romans chapter 2, and we're about midway down, about verse 13, 14, in that basic vicinity of this chapter. And we're talking about this, and Paul continues throughout this chapter in this discussion. Really what it boils down to is avoid hypocrisy. Don't trust in symbols, and don't trust in heritage, and don't trust in what was a former special connection you may have had with the Creator. Serve the Lord. Honor His will. Fulfill His purposes. Those are the things that are really meaningful. And we'll see that as we progress through the rest of this chapter. He seems to have turned his attention in he listed in chapter 1 towards the end all of those very challenging and sorrowful, sinful behaviors that he attributes to the Gentile world. It doesn't mean the Jews weren't involved in it. It just means that he kind of attributes that to them. And then he turns his attention to the Jewish folks in chapter 2 and begins to encourage them to appreciate some things as well. And in this moment here in chapter 2, in about verse 13 and 14, we'll begin to notice that he says there's a contrast, if you will, between the Jew and the Gentile. He says, "For when the Gentiles," verse 14, "which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law are a law unto themselves, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another." Now, I'm going to stop for just a moment. I opened a can of worms that I owe you at least an opportunity to comment about at the end of our study on Sunday morning. And that is an understanding of how the Gentile world was not subject to the Old Testament law like the Jews were. They were not governed by that law. It was not given to them. They were not bound to it. But it doesn't give them excuse, because the Apostle Paul here tells us that the Gentile world still should have had a conscience. They still should have understood a sense of moral fiber that I believe Paul implies here is ingrained within the very nature of creation. That God has instilled in man an ability that he should understand certain moral principles about right and wrong. And though they didn't have a written law like the Old Testament system, they didn't have anything written in stones or tablets, but they did have a conscience that should have been educated based in the very nature of God. And so the Jews had a written law, the Gentiles had a law written on their hearts, and equally are responsible morally to the standard of God and how they react to that. Notice he said that in verse 15, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another. And so to the Gentile, he could have maintained his relationship with God separate and apart from the Mosaic law. Under the original system that was passed down through the patriarchs, they would have received knowledge and information, and there would have been an understanding of God's will for them, separate and distinct from the Jews. They were not obligated, in other words, to proselyte themselves to the Jewish system. And I think, and I illustrated at the very end of our study, that Cornelius, to me, is an example of one who honored his God without having to be connected to the Jewish Mosaic system in order to do it. And I believe that from a principled standpoint of the fact that if he's genuinely the first pure Gentile, not a proselyte, not somebody that followed the Jewish system for a while and he just happened to have Gentile background, I believe he's the first absolute Gentile convert, meaning someone separate and apart from that Mosaic Jewish system. Jews had that law, the Gentiles did not, but ultimately they're all going to have to come together under who? Jesus. And that's the ultimate point that he's driving. Go ahead, Mark.
Where do you place the training or the conscience of a Gentile, like the ones who proselyted and came to the Jewish religion? Is it from seeing other Jews and how they behaved, or they was under the paganism. I just didn't understand how they would get a conscious training that they would accept.
Okay. Well, I thought I understood your question. In the last statement, you made me rethink whether I understood what you're asking.
They had your conscience has to be trained. I mean, you just don't come by it.
Right.
And consequently, God has, said that some of these Gentiles was saved by their conscience of a natural means. So how did this come about?
Yeah. And I understand what you're saying, because generally we think of a conscience as something that is developed over time based on education. And there is a sense that's accurate. It's interesting, and I started down the road of examining the word conscience because if I recall from what I was reading correctly, and I decided not to go down that road. Maybe I should have went down that road a little further, and I'd be better equipped to answer this question. But the word conscience is a hard word because it didn't exist. Okay, the word they're using and an equivalent in English didn't really exist. So they're trying to combine this idea of conscience or consciousness, being aware, and conscience, and how do you tie those? And so this word kind of gets created because of that. There could have been all kinds of means. To me, it seems like Paul is saying that there was a development of conscience that should have occurred just by the natural progression of being human and observing the right and wrong way to treat one another among humankind. That seems to me to be what he's driving at here. When he talks about by nature, they do by nature, not by training or not by learning. There in verse 14, they do by nature the things contained in the law.
That would be something that comes about naturally.
Yes. Without necessarily having to have some kind of written code that says this is what you should do. And that's why, and maybe we've got to be a little bit careful not to overstretch, not that you are, but to over, because really there's a central idea he's driving at here. The Gentiles could have maintained a relationship with God even though they weren't Jews. Did the Jew believe that? No. Jew didn't believe that. Jew believed the only way to be connected to God was through their system. And we're going to see in a minute how they belittled anyone who thought otherwise. That seems to be what he's driving. That's the point. And not necessarily a discussion of how a conscience is developed and how one matures and grows. But it's more just a statement of fact. Jews had a law that came through Moses. Gentiles had a law that came by the very nature of humankind and of what's right and what's wrong. And both could seek a relationship with God if they will honor that moral standard of God. And then ultimately they all have to come into relationship through Jesus. To me, the point seems to be more direct and simplified than all of the pieces, maybe necessarily.
But I think what you said earlier is the way that I view this and always have is that when the Jews were given the Mosaic law on Mount Sinai, that was their law, but that didn't exclude the Gentiles from the patriarchal law. So what you have from the time of Mount Sinai, even running through Christ, you have two laws running parallel with each other through time. The Mosaic law for the Jews, the patriarchal law for the Gentiles. And God didn't stop dealing with the Gentiles because when he sent Jonah, where did he send Jonah? He sent him to Nineveh. He sent him to the Gentile city in Assyria, who were the enemies of the Jews in 750 BC. They repented, and God relented of the destruction that he said he would send. So God didn't stop dealing with Gentiles for centuries. There was never, ever a time that any human being did not have a law to God. Yeah. And sorry, I know.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
But to me, it seems as if they understood right from wrong from that patriarchal system, from viewing, and they could view their Jewish neighbors worshiping God, offering sacrifices. And so to say, where did the Gentiles get this knowledge? Where did the Gentiles get this? I agree with your statement earlier. It could have come from all kinds of places. from the example of the Jews, from the patriarchal law, from just the view of what's right and wrong in society. So it could have come from okay.
And no, you're fine. You're absolutely fine. And keep in mind, he's not. That's not really the discussion. What he's doing, he's prepping the Jewish audience that he's speaking to for what he's about to say. That they need to quit thumbing their nose at the Gentiles and quit living in hypocrisy and trusting in their symbolic gestures towards God when their inward man is not honoring Him at all. And so I think maybe when we understand the focus a little bit, it helps us understand that maybe Paul's not really trying to make this conversation about where their conscience necessarily came from, so much as it is about the Gentiles can come to, because the ultimate statement's made in verse 16, that they'll all be judged according to what? According to the gospel of Christ. Yeah, ultimately, that's what everybody's going to have to answer to from that stage forward, Paul says. And so one may have had a written law, one may have had one that was written on their hearts by nature, and a conscience developed in that form. Ultimately, they all answer to the gospel, and he's not done with the Jewish folks yet in the conversation. Go ahead, Al.
What taught Abimelech that it was wrong? Abraham's wife.
Yeah, and some of those things are hard. One of the things I read in that line of thought when I wondered whether I'd pursue that or not was what's the first major? Well, not the first, because that would be eating of the tree that was forbidden. But what's the very next thing we kind of learn? Murder, right? How'd they know that? How they know? How did he know? How did Cain know that it should have been wrong for him to take his brother's life? Well, there's no record even. Now you might be able to argue, well, maybe God must have told him at some point. But there's no record of him telling him that. Nothing in Scripture that I know of that told him not to do that. And maybe that's kind of what Paul's driving at here. That within the very nature of man, Cain should have known that it was not right for him to have taken his brother's life. Even before they had a written Mosaic law, and even before maybe certain specific instructions were given. Now, maybe it's just not recorded. You can make that argument too, I suppose.
Well, sometimes we don't think about the role of priests of God even before the law. You have Jethro, you have Melchizedek, you have Balaam, who was a prophet of God even before he was given.
Had very specific roles in aiding folks in understanding their relationship with God, even prior to that priesthood that we typically think of. Go ahead, Jim.
Where did Cornelius come up with his ideas about God? Did he just?
Yeah. Well, and again, I mean, if you're asking me for a definitive answer to that, I can't give you one because it's not recorded for us. It doesn't say because he had a dad and a grandfather and a grandmother and an aunt and an uncle and all the way back. It just says that's who he was. And he came to that conclusion in some form or fashion. Yeah. So he says, verse 17, then, behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast of God. Here's where he's driving to. Okay? We have a law. I'm a Jew. We have law. We possess it. We have a law. It's making us great. And we're connected to God because we possess the law. What did Paul just tell them about law? Who else had a law? Gentiles had a law too. Quit bragging about you've got the law. That to me is what he's saying. Quit resting your faith and your convictions just because you believe you're the possessors of the law. The Gentiles had a law once too. And they can't stake any kind of special claim just because they were possessors of a law. Don't boast about that. Make us thy boast of God. Not about that you rest in this idea that we're possessors of the law. Verse 18, knowest his will, and approvest the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law, and art confident that thou thyself art a guide of the what? Of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness. That could have been true. And that could have been said in a favorable way. It could have been a positive thing to say of them. You helped the blind to see. You guided folks who needed light upon their path. I don't believe Paul's saying it in a positive way. I believe Paul is talking about the superiority that they felt because they took a claim to be the possessors of the law. You are a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness, an instructor of the what? Of the foolish. In their eyes, they saw everybody else was blind. They knew the right paths, nobody else knew them. We are light, they are darkness. We are great teachers, they are foolish. We're a teacher of what? Verse 20. Teacher of babes. We're the mature adult ones in the equation. Everybody else is the babes, which has the form of knowledge and of the truth in the law. Thou therefore which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? That thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? I'm going to get into those verses here in a minute. But he's very warning here. Be cautious of arrogance, he tells the Jews. And be cautious that you don't get this air about you where simply because the Mosaic law had been given unto you, that somehow that makes you see clearer than other people see. You're smarter than others are. Everybody else is foolish in your presence. Everybody else is a child as it relates to your maturity. Be cautious. And there's a practical, I think, lesson for us in that as well. We've got to be cautious that we don't come to the same types of conclusions that somehow because we've been blessed to learn and know about salvation in Jesus Christ, that somehow makes us better. And in particular, in the moment, especially in verses 21 and 23 through 23, that we don't get the idea that simply because we have this great connection, we're the possessors of the law, we're smarter than everybody else, that we get to do what? We get to do whatever we want. We can teach because they're babes. We can expound our wisdom because they are foolish. But live up to the standard? I'm not so sure that I have to do that. And that's what he's dealing with.
You just summed up the dark ages, right?
Yeah.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
That they looked at the common man as pigs who couldn't understand the scripture.
Yeah. And whether we don't see it exactly the same, obviously, but versions of that are still around in religious worlds, where the idea is you're not smart enough. I had a fella through not direct contact, but through indirect contact. One of our members, when I was in Moundsville, had asked a local religious fella if he would sit down and have a discussion with me. And this fella asked the other man, well, what theological school did your preacher go to? And he said he didn't. He said, then I won't sit down and talk with him. When he gets a doctorate in theology, have him give me a call. Wouldn't even have a conversation because he was already smarter, right? And that was the idea that he had. And I could give you anecdotal illustrations of that very same thing that happens. But here's the more potent warning, though. It can happen to us. I can be guilty of this, and we have to be cautious that we don't kind of become this possessive kind of thinking where in some sense the salvation is wrapped up in us, and not give the glory to God as we should.
And I think that's probably the most practical lesson for us, not to think, well, I'm a member of the Church of Christ. Well, so what?
Yeah.
You know, I give in the collection on the first day of the week. I pray the prayers. I sing the songs. Well, good for you.
Yeah.
You know, not that those things aren't important, but better be careful in thinking that somehow those things make us better.
If we're resting our salvation into the idea that we use the Bible, and we abhor creeds, we wear the right name, and we have all those things that ironed out, and then convince ourselves that those things overrule any personal character and behavioral decisions that I make, that's where Paul's got an issue here. Paul in chapter 3, not to get us ahead yet, we'll get there sometime, but in chapter 3, he talks about the fact that the Jews had a great advantage because they had access to everything that led them to Jesus. They had tremendous advantages because of that. And so it's not that those things, as you say, aren't important, but if it puffs us up, where we speak about things in condescending ways, and the superiority is not about the message of the gospel, but it's about the individuals. And I don't say this with any great pride at all, but I guarantee you that there was probably days in my early preaching where that was kind of probably the way it sounded, because it was the way I probably thought I should say it. And that was probably a mistake. I said probably 3 times. It was a mistake. To go that, they need to be talked about. The Bible, no creed. Yes, talk about that. Speak about those things that help us stay steadfast, but not as if I'm smart and you're not. And that's the great challenge in that. And as if they're foolish and I'm not. That's what Paul's condemning here in the Jews. And I think by example, he's warning us in the same fashion. Go ahead, Roger.
There's a lot of irony here. The fact that they're thinking of the Gentiles in this manner.
Yeah.
They have it all. But yet there's many at this very day still does not accept Jesus the Christ as the King of the spiritual kingdom. They thought he should be king of a material kingdom. To be a part of David's kingdom.
Yeah, the very things that were problematic to them haven't changed.
That's right. Yeah. It's irony that they think they have it all.
Yeah. And one of the great ironies, not since you walked down that road, I'll walk it with you for a minute. One of the great ironies about the history is that these, and even these folks that Paul's writing to, had committed to themselves to the idea that there's a wonderful benefit to being part of the Jewish heritage, and yet rejected the very one that the entire heritage was intended to bring about. There is tremendous irony in that fact.
They call the Gentiles heathens, dogs, and etc.
Yeah. And that's really where verses 21 through 23 take us. Thou therefore which teachest another, teachest not thyself. Thou that preachest a man should not steal. Are you a thief? Do you steal? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery. Do you commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Thou that makest thy boast of the law, through breaking the law dishonorest thou God. You can't preach it and then live how you want to live. You can't teach another that he shouldn't steal and then be a thief. You can't tell others what the law teaches and then act as though we don't have to live by that standard. I want to take you back into the Old Testament for a moment in Ezekiel chapter 22. Ezekiel chapter 22. I believe I want to let me look at my notes real quick. Verse 26. Notice he said, her priests have violated my law and have profaned my holy things. They have put no difference between the holy and profane. Neither have they showed difference between the unclean and the clean, and have hid their eyes from my Sabbath. And I am profane among them. Notice in the middle of at the end of verse 22, thou abhorrest, back into Romans, Thou abhorrest the idols, supposedly. But even in those olden days, they claim on one side to be believers only in God, but yet sacrilege was common. They had been taking the holy and making it common on regular basis. Even their priesthood was failing in honoring the law as they should. The Jews had a temptation that I think is parallel to the way Christians need to be reminded of today. And that is that simply because I'm connected to the law isn't sufficient in the eyes of God. And back a little bit to what Jonathan was talking about earlier, if I'm relying solely on the idea that I'm a regular worship attender, that I do these particular things that have been classified as qualifying somebody as being faithful, be careful. Those things can be evidences of my faith, absolutely, but they don't amount to equals faithful, simply because I stay connected to religious spiritual things. Because the Jews did exactly that. They stayed connected, but in their lives and their character and their decisions and their choices, they were completely disconnected from the very things God was asking of them. And very hypocritical in the process. Because if you asked them what the law was, and by the way, that happens in the days of Ezekiel, it happened in the days of Paul, and it also happened in the days of Jesus. How many times did he come to them and basically say, "You hypocrites, you do this, but you fail miserably in these other areas. You'd strain a gnat, but you'd swallow a camel in the process. You would make sure that you gave a tenth, that you would tithe every single spice in the rack. But you let weightier matters of the law go on a regular basis." They would tell you. In fact, he warns folks, do what the Jews or do what the Pharisees in particular say, but do not what? Don't do what they do. Because they know the law. They don't live the law. And that's the challenge. And we can be the same. Trusting in all the wrong things. And I want to go down that path just a little later in something else that Paul says.
Say something a little bit ago about just knowing they didn't been out, etc. One verse came to my mind in Matthew 16, verse 24. There's 4 action verbs in that one little passage. Then Jesus said unto his disciples, "If any man will come after me, deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." He must come, deny, take up, and follow. Follow includes a lot of things.
Yeah. And missing any one of those things leaves us short. And that's something that they needed to understand, and we as well. Go ahead, Mom.
Genesis, when God commanded them to be circumcised after 8 days, it was a sign of the covenant, not your favoritism from God. And the Jews felt that they were circumcised, that they had God's favor. They could do what they wanted to.
Yeah. And that's exactly what he's going to address here in just a moment, is that flawed concept that they had as it related to that. The problem with this hypocrisy, though, that it wasn't just affecting them, right? What was happening according to verse 24?
Dishonoring God and blaspheming.
Yeah, God's being blasphemed because of this. Okay, you all were out in the streets and the marketplaces proclaiming your connection to Jehovah. And then those same folks who you're proclaiming that to look at your life and say, "Wait a minute, there's a disconnect here." They preach and say all the right things and give the appearances that they're religious people, but when I examine their lives, there's no connection here. And it's bad enough that it would bring reproach upon the person themselves. But the problem is, who generally gets the blame for that? God does. And you see that, by the way, throughout the history of man. Where what happens is when man fails in a spiritual matter, that individual may suffer certain consequences, but ultimately that gets attached to the God they serve. And that's a problem. That's difficult. There are multiple occasions within Scripture where God makes certain decisions and He knows that His own name is going to take a hit because of the way He has to deal with His people. Jeremiah talks a little bit about that. Even in the days of Moses, what's Moses pleads with him. The people around us are going to see what you're doing and wonder what's going on, what's happened to you, and he kind of pleads the case based on that. The sad part about, and let's bring it personal for a minute, the sad part about our own hypocrisy is that it doesn't just affect us. It ultimately affects the ability for us to continue to take the message of Jesus into a community. And hypocrisy has been a challenge from the get-go. It has been a difficult circumstance. And, this doesn't mean we'll be perfect. It doesn't mean that we're going to live a life without error and without even at times sinful behaviors. And I think sometimes the difference between the fine line maybe between penitence and the right kind of character about my failures and hypocrisy is my willingness to acknowledge when I've stepped outside the bounds of God. Hypocrisy comes when I just continue to claim a relationship with God, but my choices and decisions show otherwise. The penitent heart, who acknowledges I failed, who acknowledges I didn't live up to God's standard as I should in that moment. The penitent has the ability to demonstrate how we can avoid the challenges of hypocrisy and the difficulties that hypocrisy brings. But it's a problem. And I could be wrong on this, but my belief is that modern times and the modern communications availability that we have today have a ready-made ability to point out hypocrisy faster than it's ever been pointed out before. People are calling us on it. People, and across the board. And again, if you look around our social climate right now, I mean, from media moguls to on-air personalities to politicians to folks who for a long time apparently went unchallenged and unchecked. All of a sudden, there's a climate of people getting called out for the hypocritical approaches and decisions and choices, and I don't think that's going to stop. I think it has lit a flame, if you will, where more and more people are going to speak up and say that's hypocrisy. You can't claim that when this is the reality. And we need to be ready for that. I think people are more apt to call the hypocrisy of Christian folks who claim a relationship with Jesus, maybe faster now than they ever did before. Now, maybe that's just my perception, but that I believe that to be true.
I just thought of Hebrews 6:6. It says that they shall fall away, to renew them again and to repent and sing they crucified to themselves the Son of God afresh, to put him to an open shame. And if we thought about it in that context, maybe that would help us make better decisions.
Yeah, and to address our failures in a timely fashion. Not to bring a sports reference in, but it's what comes to mind. But I was listening to Bob Huggins' interview the other day, and he was talking about officiating and his thoughts of their failures at times. And anyway, but he made this comment. He said he would appreciate if just when a bad call is made, the ref would walk over and say, "I blew that one," and go on about the game. because it diffuses, right? He can't keep arguing. He can't keep fussing over it. He can't keep complaining about it. It's been diffused. I acknowledged I missed that call. Let's move on. And I think we need more of that idea in our lives. I did that. I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have acted that way. And diffuse it. But what happens is pride enters the picture, all of the above, right? Begins to block the process by where we should just walk the path of the penitent. Just acknowledge it. And it's amazing how that can diffuse those who challenge us for hypocrisy. It can diffuse all manner of future challenges if we just say it and acknowledge those things and do better. And it certainly, I think, would take the black eye away from the Lord if we started owning up to our own accountability. God didn't make me do that. I chose it, and I need to, and I seek your forgiveness for that. Verse 25. For circumcision verily profiteth, if, right? For circumcision verily, it's not profitless. It is. He didn't say it's not with. It's completely empty of any benefit. What he said was, circumcision verily profiteth if thou keep the law. But if thou be a breaker of the law, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision. Therefore, if the uncircumcision keep the righteousness of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? Why honor the symbol of the covenant, but not the covenant? That's what he's saying. The circumcision was about honoring the covenant that God had made as it relates to the seed promise that through Abraham's seed all nations of the earth would be blessed. The circumcision wasn't made, ahead of the covenant. The covenant was made, and the circumcision is the reminder, the symbol of that covenant. The greater importance of those two things is the covenant. Honor the covenant. Don't just show signs and symbols of it. Because if an uncircumcised man actually keeps himself to the laws and principles of God, his uncircumcision can be counted for him as circumcision. In other words, what matters is whether we honor God. The Jew needed to honor circumcision because that was the law they were under. But it didn't end everything for them. It didn't create a circumstance where they had no further obligations from that point forward. They were given a covenant, and that covenant was going to have to be honored. And just because you could say, well, I was circumcised on the 8th day, didn't exempt you from obedience to the law. And it seems to me that Paul's still coming down pretty hard on some of the Jewish concepts that they had as it pertains to salvation and righteousness.
The Jew is actually considering himself as being circumcised of the guarantee from God, which actually the sign is a guarantee from God for the children of Israel at the end of the day.
Yeah. And it's amazing how they had created such a disconnect between the symbolic nature of the law that God had given them to help remind them of what was important, whereas the symbols became more important than the law itself. And that was what was sad about their circumstance. Notice he said, verse 27, and shall not uncircumcision, which is by nature, it's the way you're born. I think that's what he's saying there. The way you're born, if it fulfill the law, judge thee, who by the letter in circumcision does transgress the law. There was a basic contrast, and sometimes it would be spoken as Jew, Gentile. Sometimes the separation of men would be considered circumcision, those of the circumcision and those of the uncircumcision. And so what Paul, I believe, does here is simply say to the Jews, all this time you thought you were judging over the Gentiles. All this time you thought you were wise and they were foolish. All this time you had sight, they were blind. All this time you thought that but the reality was, every time a Gentile honored the will of God, and you trusted in the symbols rather than obeying the law of God, they were actually judging you. It was actually vice versa. Go ahead.
We need to remember also that what Paul writes in chapter 1 and chapter 2, he's writing before the time of Christ. He's talking about that time before Christ, where the Gentile could still have, we said earlier, could still have relationship with God, even though they didn't have the law of Moses because you said earlier, once Christ came, they were brought under the law together with Christ. So I believe he's still writing with that idea before Christ came. Here's what your situation was.
And maybe there's an overlying purpose behind the writings too that we need to remind ourselves, because sometimes when we get into the details we forget the big picture. But ultimately the problem in Rome among Christians is the diversity between the Jew and the Gentile Christians was so strenuous at times. And how do we address that problem? How do we stay unified, being so different from our backgrounds and our situations? And one of the early things Paul's doing in this letter is simply first he tells the Gentiles, you were pretty bad. These were pretty bad things you were involved in. Then he turns around and says to the Jews, you were in some senses worse because you claimed a relationship with God. You were doing the same things. And then he eventually brings them to the point where the unifying factor and the important factor in all this is Jesus. Go ahead, Brian.
I guess my question is, before Christ gave his life for humanity and the Gentiles, Paul makes a statement in Ephesians, speaking by inspiration, that in time ye were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope, and without God in the world. So my question is, that conscience again, how do they have it? I mean, I understand from the beginning, before the sin entered the garden, man had a direct connection with his Savior. He walked with him the cool day. And that as far as I can see, that conscience is still there, but before Christ gave his life, according to this, Gentiles had no hope of God. From the commonwealth and the promises. Because these were mysteries that were not revealed until this moment.
And that does create a challenging question as it relates to men like Cornelius, who's spoken of as a devout man, and he had to have been that prior to Jesus, and maybe some digging into Paul's message to Ephesus might help some in trying to figure out exactly what's the point of his thought. But I hear what you're saying. There is context within Scripture that shows that the Gentile, as the Gentile world, in the condition that they were in a very generic form, if you will, hopeless. Remaining in that state left them hopeless until the coming of Jesus, where he allows for them to come into covenant relationship with God through him. And I think there's aspects of Scripture that remind the Gentiles of the beauty of the adoption that God, because he talks about, Paul's going to talk about how they get grafted in. Not that they were just immediately had the same connection that the Jews, but they were grafted into this. And so there's certainly, I think, some fair thought as it comes to that.
Brian,
Uh-huh.
during the patriarchal age, there was no law, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not do this and that. But they knew that they shouldn't do things. Even the Gentiles in the time of the Mosaic law had laws in their areas or regions. You shouldn't kill, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. And if you do, you're going to be punished. So that, even though they didn't know God, they knew some of the right moral things to do.
And I think that's kind of the principle that Paul's addressing here, that even without a written law, there are certain principles that they should be able to grasp and understand by the very nature in which God has created. And I think that would be true even if you want to back and clear up to Genesis. I put high emphasis on the fact that the Bible tells us that we were created in the image of God. The image by which we were formed was the goodness of God. And we, like some even of the angelic beings, then made behavioral choices from that point forward that put us in jeopardy and difficulty. But our nature's good.
Verse 21 of the first chapter. Because that when they knew God, they did glorify Him not as God. So there was a point in time where they knew Him, but they did not receive Him as God.
And I think that's a fair connection to some things that Brian was saying, because they're in a very broad sense of the term, not necessarily every single individual, but in a very broad sense of the term, he says because they refused to keep Him in the honest, He turned them over to a reprobate mind. He allowed for them to become who they had become. And just because there is an exception here or there, like maybe Cornelius, doesn't change the overall reality that the Gentile world as a whole had been given over to a reprobate mind, was absolutely hopeless until Jesus enters the picture and gives them opportunity to come to God.
When we first talked about this, a thought entered my mind because I was reading a paper on evolution the other day, and one of the points that this made was evolution is still, or atheists for that matter, they still have a concept of right and wrong. So the approach would say, well, where does that come from? Where does that come from?
I think one of the, and when you deal with all those kinds, I know you're well read on those some of those things, but to me, all those things always come back to, well, the starting point is what they can't answer, and that to me, I'll answer the starting point. The starting point when it comes to creation is in the beginning, God, right? I'm willing to state my starting point. They don't have one. They can't tell you where the energy came from. They can't. And that's the reality of that. But you're right. I think that's, where'd you come up with a moral standard? And how did you make a decision about what was right and wrong? How do you do that separate and apart from some ingrained nature that could not come from survival of the fittest? Because, that's every man for himself. Can I stop you? No. No, go ahead, Doc. No, I'm so sorry. Go ahead. I'm just kidding.
Christ, if we're talking about who had hope and who didn't, Christ is a central figure in all of this, in Genesis to Revelation. And the one thing we need to keep in mind, we talk about the Gentiles, but if Christ had not died, nobody would be saved. Yeah. Not even the Jews under the old law.
Right. Yeah. It's the pivotal fact.
Without Christ, everyone is hopeless.
Okay. And ultimately, Paul says it's inward, right? It's who you are, not the symbols. It's who you are in verse 29.
Well, basically, he's quoting Moses back to the law. Moses said that God was circumcised the heart.
Yeah. All right. Lord willing, then, we'll come back in and jump into chapter 3 on Sunday. And thank you all for your good comments.